Hello! We're Doug and Candie Langdale, Emmy-winning animation writer-producers. If you're an animation fan, you've probably seen our work. Maya and the Three, Book of Life, Samurai Rabbit, Scooby-Doo, Ninja Turtles, Dave the Barbarian, The Weekenders, and so much more.
And now we're here to talk about the world of animation, from the blood, sweat, and tears of development to the glorious premieres, from Winsor McCay to Guillermo del Toro, from stop motion to computer graphics. We are your cartoon insiders.
We're here with David Dozoretz, director, writer, virtual production, visual effects. What else, David? Producer.
I'm very honored to be invited on your podcast, which I listened to a few, and I found them very educational.
You found them very tolerable. Well, we're glad that you're here.
Yes.
What made you first decide what you were going to do for a living? Like, how did you know? And also, what was that? Like, what did you want to be when you grow up?
Well, when I was a kid, one of the things I wanted to be was a physician, like my dad, a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
He came home one day from work and said, "Whatever you do, don't be a doctor."
Okay.
Wow.
What kind of doctor?
He was like a cardiologist, general practitioner, but it wasn't because he didn't like practicing medicine. He just saw the writing on the wall with insurance companies and just how the business of medicine was turning into a beast.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, don't do that. I still had a little bit of an interest in medicine, so I ended up becoming an EMT. Just as backup in case I couldn't get a job in the film industry. I should probably refresh my EMT. And then, it's a bit of a cliche, but I saw a little movie called Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And that got me really interested in, and we can talk about this, but it was, speaking of non-Hollywood films, I had a cinema paradiso moment when I was watching Star Wars about falling in love with film. I also wanted to be in Star Wars. I wanted to be, like a astronaut or a pilot, but my eyesight wasn't good enough to be a pilot. So that didn't work out. But
I think what you need is the Force.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I was just always fascinated with the Star Wars stuff. My sister worked at, back when there was not as many I guess that there's fewer movie theaters now, but for a while there was movie theaters and multiplexes everywhere. But when I was growing up in Phoenix in the 70s and 80s, there was one major movie theater called Cine Capri. Mm-hmm. That was the big movie theater in Phoenix with the best screen and projectors anyway. My sister worked there, and she took me up into the projection room during I think it was, one of the Star Wars films. And I got to stand on a little box and peer out next to the projector, and all the dust was floating in the light, and it was hot, and you hear the whirring of the projector and everything. And I could see some Star Wars out on the screen. And that was like wow, this is a really cool, magical moment thing.
Wow.
Sort of got me interested in that, but I never really thought that it was possible or really understood what went into it until a book came out called The Art of Special Effects, which is a book that was basically about Industrial Light and Magic, George Lucas's special effects company, because it was obviously what was used to create Star Wars, and not a whole lot of other visual effects was done prior to that. There was the Ray Harryhausens and the Doug Trumbulls, but not that many people. It didn't really hit huge popularity as far as finding out how people did that movie magic until that book came out. And when I read that book, I was like, this is a cool career path.
So did you go to school for it or did you just teach yourself? Like, how does that work? Then, especially.
Well, there was no school for
Right. That's what I'm
visual effects
Yeah.
back then.
That
Mhm.
book was the school.
That book was the school, and it listed the people who were really some of the only people in the world who were doing it. I mean, again, Disney had to do some visual effects. Kubrick did some visual effects. There was some of it out there, but it wasn't, you know, and there was some cheesy stuff, Flash Gordon, whatever. Great
Yeah.
for the time. But that book was the school. So I read that book cover to cover a few times and then found out somehow that the Lucas organizations in Northern California had an internship program.
Mhm.
Ah,
Applied for it. I ignorantly applied for my number one choice was business affairs because I thought, being completely ignorant, that that was about deals and, you know, packaging things and some story development and stuff like that. Of course, it was the legal department.
yeah.
So happily, the internship coordinator looked at sort of my background and said, no, not in a million years. I'll put them in the art department. They need a body.
Excellent.
So I went to the art department of Industrial Light and Magic. And from like the first 30 seconds, I was hooked. I met half the people that were in the book
Wow.
and had these amazing mentors there. Ty Ellingson, Mark Moore, Doug Chang, and Claudia. I could just go on and on with the names of all the people in the art department that just said, okay, you have no art experience whatsoever, but we will teach you. And they taught me, and I still don't have anywhere near those level of art skills. But it was 1990, like one or two, and they were starting to use this thing called a computer in the art department.
Yeah.
And for certain things. And I was a bit of a computer nerd. I had an Apple IIe when I was growing up. So I kind of became and there were some other people before me, Stephen Duncan obviously, and others who were fantastic, but there I kind of became the person who could translate the computer department's language to the art guys and the art language to the computer guys a little bit. But I was basically computer support for the art department. There was a person there named John Knoll who was introducing a little thing he was working on with his brother called Photoshop.
Oh, wow.
So I got one of the first versions of Photoshop
Wow.
and became somewhat skilled in that. So whenever there was any Photoshop work that needed to be done, it was directed towards me. So I ended up working on I went from not being in the film department. Like I in college I was in film studies, theory and criticism actually, not production.
Yes.
Mhm.
Which served me well for reasons I can go into if you want. But the most basic of which being that all of the technology was about to change. But I went to college at University of Arizona, which was not really known as a film school, but it had a great media theory and criticism program.
Yeah.
So I learned to I watched every Blake Edwards movie. And you
Uh-huh.
think to yourself, why in the world would you care about Pink Panther? But they were actually artistically brilliant.
Panther movies.
Yeah, and he had the whole philosophy of not calling attention to the direction.
He had a philosophy of not calling attention to the direction, but he also played with gender roles a lot.
Yep.
And he did a lot with off-screen space that nobody had ever done before.
Yeah.
But I watched all the John Ford movies, Howard Hawks movies. I know it's weird going from like Blake Edwards to Howard Hawks to Hitchcock. I watched every Hitchcock film and watched The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and the original Scarface. And the reason why I was saying this sort of served me well is because that knowledge of film theory and criticism was something that I could rely on when I was talking with filmmakers, with directors later.
Yes.
Mhm.
It it became I think I became a little useful to them more than just a production hand, more than just a tool. And I found that a lot of the people that I've worked with who really excelled at their job knew a lot more about film theory and history than just being able to push buttons on a computer keyboard.
Yeah.
The way I like to describe it is that it's important that you don't just study the pencil, but you also study the drawing.
Yes.
So a lot of times in my career, young people have come to me and they've said, I want to get into computer animation, or I want to get into filmmaking. What program should I learn? What, types of drawing should I do? And a lot of times my answer is go watch old films.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's important.
So that's a theory that I have that's come out of my experience. But what was I talking about? Oh, so I ended up being able to work at ILM, like going from almost no experience in the film industry to suddenly I was working on Jurassic Park and Forrest Gump.
I love that your first credit is Star Wars. That's something that people aspire to work their way up to, and you started there.
Yeah, I got a credit on the re-release of the special edition, which George wanted to do a little bit more work on, which everybody knows about and which we can go into if you want, on the original Star Wars film. So he re-released it in 97, I think. That was I think now that's the only version that's you can buy now. There still might be ones floating around.
I still have my VHS tapes of the originals that I won't get rid of.
Hold on to those and try and find a VHS player.
Oh, I have 3.
I had Betamax.
Ooh,
wow.
Okay.
But before ILM, I actually had an internship working for the Post Group, a post-production facility in Hollywood. And I was in the tape library. So we had 3/4-inch tape. I don't even know if you've heard it. I mean, it was the professional version of VHS. Back to Star Wars. When he re-released it, it became sort of the only official version out, and therefore I got a credit on it because I did some design work on some of the shots. And now, but they kept, I guess on IMDb, they kept it as listed as released in 1977.
So you worked on it in the first grade.
I worked on it when I was 6.
Yeah. Good job.
Awesome.
You were
Probably the work I did, in 97 was about the quality as if
Stop it.
But yeah, that was sort of a dream come true. Yeah, that was fun.
That's crazy.
That's like you made it.
Yeah. Well, I didn't work on it that much. He only wanted to do a few changes, but they were changes that were some, people agree with, some people don't, but there were changes that were kind of a big deal in a lot of cases. So
the dewbacks.
The dewback scene I did.
Yeah.
Oh.
George wanted the stormtroopers to look like they were really searching more for the droids than able to do in the original film. In the original film, it was like he just couldn't get the shots that he wanted.
We saw Jabba for the first time. Well, not for the first time.
The first time in that
in that universe.
Yeah. And so he shot it with a human being for Jabba.
I've seen that.
Yeah, and then they put the digital Jabba over it, which was mildly successful at best, but it still wasn't the most controversial thing in the re-release.
It was exciting for the fans.
Yeah, got to see him step on Jabba.
To see Jabba in the first movie. So
yeah,
or the fourth movie, depending on how you want to number it.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, it was so. I mean, I was just so blessed in my career to be able to work at ILM. In my opinion, the most exciting place to work at the most exciting time to be there.
You were there like at the beginning of all the computer stuff.
Yeah.
Pretty early on. There was a little bit of computer stuff happening before I was there. There was a sequence in one of the Star Trek movies that was the creation of a planet. There was this stained glass window night that
Oh yeah, and Sherlock Holmes.
young Sherlock Holmes, that was digital. There was of course, Cameron pushed a lot of the technology, so there was the water snake sequence in The Abyss.
Remember that.
Then there was, and that was a couple of shots. Then Cameron pushed it further with the Terminator 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was Jurassic, which is when I got there. So I got there about halfway through Jurassic's production.
Do you remember what you did on Jurassic Park?
I was not in, remember, I was in the art department, not the computer graphics department. So the art director was Ty Ruben Ellingson, who was the visual effects art director, and he became sort of my mentor. So I did whatever he asked me to do, whether it was mounting storyboards or photoshopping collages of different things that he drew together or getting reference for things. We did a lot of reference of stuff. And I was told never, ever, ever go into dailies in C building for Jurassic Park. That is verboten because you are just an intern and not an official ILM employee. I did it anyway.
Woo!
I got to see all the stuff that was in progress. So, I mean, really it was not quite as remedial as getting coffee, but I would have gladly gotten coffee for any of them if they asked.
Yeah.
So it was very basic artwork, but it was just great to be around and watch all that stuff that was happening.
Yeah.
And then you went
I
on.
worked on multiple films at the same time. So I was also working, for Mark Moore on Mars Attacks, and for although that might have been a little bit later. There was just, ILM at the time could handle about 10 films at once, maybe.
Yeah. That's a lot.
Between 5 and 10 films at a time. Yeah.
Do you remember the first time you met George Lucas?
The first time I met George was actually probably early 95 when he came into the ILM art department meeting for into the art department conference room for a meeting. They were talking at one point about doing a themed restaurant at Disneyland, like the Cantina in Star Wars.
They should have done that.
Oh yeah.
The amount of stuff that they should have done that they didn't is back then. Anyway, now Disney's doing all of it. But so there was a bunch of artwork. I forgot who created it for that he came in, and I was just helping set up art for the meeting and like mounting the artwork and ways. And I think I met him just very cordially there, but it was super nice. Of course, he's incredibly down to earth, very, very not Hollywood. And he would not have remembered me in a million years at that point. A few years later, I became the third person overall and the first computer artist hired for the prequels. So I started having meetings with him like every couple of days.
Yeah.
But he was still to this day probably one of my favorite directors to work with.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
I met him and Francis Ford Coppola at the same time, and I just stood there and stared at George's hair. I didn't know what to do.
That's the correct response, actually.
Yeah.
Stare at the hair.
Yeah.
For our podcast listeners, I am without hair, and
I didn't know where to look.
And there was a time, I don't know if I ever told you guys this story, but for my birthday one year, one of the really nice people at Skywalker Ranch, Jonathan Bresman, he and the post-production coordinator, Ruth Hasty, decided to give me the day off of work. So they put together this was very sweet. They put together a scavenger hunt for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to run around Skywalker Ranch, just like trying to solve all these clues and finding all these things. And the last bit of the scavenger hunt was a task for me to go find George. And I was already starting to thin at that point. But to go find George and tell him that I've always really admired his hair and neck.
Wow.
Did you do it?
Did
Oh,
it.
wow.
I did it. And George was in on the joke. He knew about it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
He knew about it ahead of time, and he just because I walked into the editing room. He was sitting in there with the editor Martin Smith. I walked into the editing room, and George is just over in the corner, sitting on the couch, just giggling to himself because he knew it was coming. There was a lot of moments with George which were really like just not Hollywood, and he was just human and fun.
Mhm.
At one point, we were in the middle of editing, and there was a fly that was bothering him, and he decided that he needed to get rid of the fly, and for some reason Martin gave him those cans of air that are air horns that you take.
Oh no.
Oh my.
George is running around the editing room trying to kill a fly with sound, with like this.
Wow.
Got Ben Burt to do it.
Ben was in the next room, so I don't know if Ben was like, God damn it, I'm having a hard time editing sound. Anyway, there was just a lot of moments with George that were really fun, and you kind of knew he's George Lucas and I'm nobody, this 25-year-old kid who's just lucky to be there. So he didn't have any need whatsoever to. He just had no ego at all. Like everybody knew where they stood.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
It was George's show.
Yeah.
So he just had fun with it.
That's cool. I just can't get over the fact that, like, you were a kid, you saw Star Wars, you said, I want to work on Star Wars. And it was like, well, they already made Star Wars. So that's obviously impossible. There's absolutely no way that's going to happen.
and then you worked on
And then you like went back in time and worked on Star Wars.
Well, I have to say that George told me that's the only reason he decided to remake the film, was so that I
it.
could.
It's for you. Nice guy.
You manifested that.
No, I mean, I just was. ILM at that time was either people who were hired to work on Star Wars and made Star Wars, or people who saw Star Wars and wanted to work on Star Wars. It was only that, because when I started in ILM, it was less than 175 people, and they were all fantastic, from the senior people down to the machinists who would make the armatures for the puppets for Yoda or whatever. I was just really lucky to be in the right. Everybody at that time felt so incredibly blessed to be there.
Yeah.
I was really lucky that I was able to work on the Star Wars that came out that got me into it, and to work on subsequent Star Wars, whether people love them or not. It was still like a really magical time to be able to do that, and a really great work experience, because George is an independent filmmaker. There's no studio. So we got to try amazing things. Probably my biggest job on Phantom Menace was the pod race. I was doing something called pre-visualization at the time, which is using computer animation to plot out the shots before you go and really shoot them and spend the big money. And George just loves car racing, and he loved the Ben-Hur chariot sequence. So we just kept on making new shots for that sequence. And the pod race version that ended up in the film was 9.5 minutes long, but I had a version that was 25 minutes long.
Wow.
I just worked on it for years and made more and more versions of stuff.
Wow. That's a lot of pod race.
Yeah, it was a bit long. But hopefully we got some of the best stuff in and cut some of the fat out.
Exciting.
Yeah.
And it was great working at, Skywalker Ranch was a really magical place to be able to work at, despite being far away and hard to, I did work incredibly hard. I've told people before who said, oh, it must have been fantastic to be at Skywalker Ranch. Yes and no. When you're working at like 10:30 at night and you haven't eaten anything, and the 3 restaurants are closed, it would cost you $65 to have a cold pizza delivered and 2 hours later.
Oh
So
my.
Wow.
we worked hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In isolation.
Yeah, for the first couple of years, it was just me doing pre-visualization, and for at least a year, it was only me and Doug Chang and Terrell Whitlack, the 2 artists, and the coordinator Jill Jerkowitz. So there was probably like a year it was just 4 people,
Yeah.
and then we all started to expand a lot more as George was fleshing out the idea more. Ian McCaig came on, Ben Jew came on, Jay Schuster, these unbelievably great artists, Ed Natividad. And then I started to hire more previs people. And then by episode 2, we became much bigger as well.
Well, and then, I mean, previs became your thing.
Previs sort of became my thing. I wasn't the only person who was doing it at the time, but it was being done like for a few shots here and a few shots there. And then right around the time I started on Star Wars, Phantom Menace, some people were doing more and more of it, but Phantom Menace, to my knowledge, was the biggest use of pre-visualization. For those who are not familiar with it, pre-visualization is using relatively low-cost computer software, 3D software, to make almost a crappy video game version looking of the film before you actually go and do the real stuff. Actually, to rewind a little bit, I did it for Mission Impossible 1 when I was at ILM. There was the sequence where Tom Cruise's character is on the top of a bullet train, the French TGV, and it goes into a tunnel, like pursued by a helicopter. And I did a computer animation pre-visualization version of that when I was at ILM working for John Knoll. And it was pretty terrible. Slow, hard. I mean, it was just horrible to look at now in retrospect, but it helped communicate what the idea was. And all that previs is supposed to do, it's not supposed to, there's different schools of thought about this. It doesn't need to look beautiful. And in fact, it probably shouldn't look beautiful because you don't want people judging it for how realistic it looks.
Yes.
You just want to know, is this shot in the movie? Is this story in the movie? And sort of what's interesting about it is it's 3D animation, but it's animation for the purpose of serving a live action movie.
Yeah.
So pre-visualization did sort of become my thing. I created a company for it, and how I created a company for it, to go back to 2D animation or 2.5D animation a little bit. After I was done with Phantom Menace, I think you guys know this story. After I was done with Phantom Menace, I was taking a break, but a friend of mine who was running post-production at 20th Century Fox named Ted Galliano, who was also a great mentor, he had a movie that Fox Animation was doing come across his desk called Titan AE.
Yeah.
Titan AE was a Don Bluth, Gary Goldman movie. They were running it in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm not quite sure why they decided to open an animation studio in Phoenix, but they were having a couple of problems with the 3 big action sequences in the movie. And somebody said, gosh, you know what we really need is something like the pod race. Oh, let's get the guys that did the pod race. So Ted Galliano called up Rick McCallum, the producer of Star Wars, and Rick said, yes, Martin Smith, the editor, David Dozoretz, the previs guy, you can use them until we get started on episode 2. So I took a crew down to Phoenix, and we did new versions of those 3 action sequences in Titan AE. One was this sequence where a spaceship was flying around in between all these ice crystals out in the middle of space. Yes. There was something that was like glowing space, manta rays, and the end action sequence. I forget what it was about. So that was pre-visualization, which was using 3D, low-cost 3D animation.
Yeah.
But to then service a 2D animated film. So I had done it for live
Oh.
action. Now I had done it for a 2D film. Later in my career, I've done it for 3D animated films. But previs is just, fancy storyboards, not meant to ever replace storyboarding. It can't. Storyboarding is still the fastest way to get an idea from brain to paper. And previs works really well when great storyboard artists tell us, give us a direction. But previs has become a bit of an industry standard.
Yeah.
And a great way to be able to, it has its moments of being controversial, but I made a 20-year career out of doing previs for high-end visual effects films.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of planning, just insanely meticulous planning that has to go into those shots that are, composited from so many elements, and you have to know when you're shooting the live action, how it's going to fit in with everything. I mean, you need previs for that. It has to be super planned.
Yeah, at the level of, with today's level of visual effects in movies, yes, and streaming, yes. Back when there was 40 shots in movies, 40 visual effects shots in movies, you could sort of get away without it. But when we, I think Jurassic had something like, I don't know, maybe 100, 150 visual effects shots in it. And Phantom Menace had something like over 2,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
All of them have, that many, either visual effects shots that or invisible. And so, yes, it is certainly something that has become a very useful tool for people, both. So now there's pre-visualization, there's pitch visualization to try and get the movie greenlit. There's tech viz, which is figuring out where our camera needs to start and stop and at what lens, for the purpose of like rigging and knowing how big the stage and the green screen need to be. There's post viz so that we can do a rough version of the animation of the visual effects shot before we hand it off to the ILM and Weta's of the world. So there's now a whole range of stuff.
Speaking of Phantom Menace, do you mind sharing the Phantom Menace story?
There's many Phantom Menace stories, but
I'm sorry. Speaking of Phantom Menace,
sorry.
do you mind sharing the Darth Maul story?
Yes, I will share the Darth Maul story. Back in the mid-90s, being a computer nerd was considered a bad thing, instead of now it's like you're employed and a millionaire of a startup. So I was sort of always known as the computer nerd around the office. Ian McCaig was the new illustrator in the Star Wars art department on Phantom Menace, and he is probably the best in the world at doing people, at doing great character faces of people, real or imagined, and he's just phenomenal at that stuff. And when he was designing, he would frequently take real people, sometimes from around the office, and do designs based on them. So because I was the computer nerd, Ian decided to do a drawing of me with a circuit board on my face. And it was just a weird thing, I think, that he was doing just for fun, George said, just experiment and come up with weird characters. He did some other people in the office too, but George looked at this pattern on the drawing of me, and he sort of said, that's the direction I want to go for the bad guy. Now make it scary. Or I should say scarier than a picture of David Dozoretz with a circuit board on his. So that initial drawing of my head with this pattern turned into the first drawing that Ian did of Darth Maul.
So what I'm hearing is that you are Darth Maul.
There's a little bit of evil in me, I would say yes. But Ray Park, the actor, really brought him to life. Obviously, Ian took what was a rather silly drawing of me. I was silly looking with a circuit board on my face, and George said, now make it your worst nightmare. And that's when Ian took it to the next level, that everybody looked at that drawing and went, okay, we're done. That's it.
Yeah.
That's like, because you had to come up with something that was better than Darth Vader. That was creepier than Darth Vader, or
Right.
more scary or impressive, or than Darth Vader, and it was different but devilish, and yeah, it worked really well. There was a time when George was playing around, I think, with the idea of Darth Maul being a female, and I think he actually went back to that idea even, and was considering it even more for episode 2,
Darth Molly.
Clones, but he never doing that, I think.
Darth Molly. That's great.
George was really great at taking the best. He's the best in the world at world building. Sebulba's pod racer, the cockpit of it is the back half of an A-10 Warthog airplane.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
So I think either John Goodson or John Duncan, one of the model makers in the art department at that time, they were what we called kit bashing. They were going to the store and buying models, real models, and then changing them around and grabbing a little bit of this model and a little bit of that model. And it ended up becoming Sebulba's pod racer. And we just took influences from all of these unusual places. Certainly a lot of it was from old film history. As I said, the pod race was the Ben-Hur chariot race, but with aircraft engines. And it was just really a fun time, because for probably the first 2 years, maybe even 3 years of the 5 that I worked on Phantom Menace, the first couple years was just play, just experiment with cool ideas, cool designs, cool shots. George knew the general direction of like the beginning, middle, and end, and who the characters were, but there was a lot of experimentation in there. So it was super fun.
So you worked on Forrest Gump, Disclosure, Casper, Jumanji, Mission Impossible, Dragonheart, Phantom Menace, Titan AE, Moulin Rouge. I love Moulin Rouge.
A lot of what you just mentioned was stuff when I was at ILM, and you would touch a little bit of all these different films.
Right.
But Moulin Rouge, Fox hired my company specifically for, and they sent me the script. And I have to admit, when I read the script, I was like, there's not a chance in hell this is going to work. And
Really?
Wow.
boy, was I on the page, it seems ridiculous. It was like, and then they start breaking out into Madonnas, but boy, was I wrong. I mean, it just, no pun intended. It
I
just
love me a good musical.
it sung. And that was a fun one to work on, because first of all, I got to go to Australia for the first time.
Ooh,
And
you
back,
sound like Osamo.
yeah.
Really?
Nice guy. Only works with the best people.
Of course.
And but it was working on it, as opposed to Star Wars or the other movies that you mentioned. A lot of them are, the visual effect is very much in your face, and Moulin Rouge was invisible visual effects.
Yeah.
Right. You can think, oh, that's a heavy visual effects movie.
Right.
Right.
And Forrest Gump had a lot of that too. There was the obvious stuff like Kennedy shaking hands with Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
But there was massive amounts of Forrest Gump that were invisible effects. Like the entire University of Alabama football sequence. There's this point where young Forrest is playing football and he runs across the entire football field without getting tackled. They didn't shoot that at a football stadium.
Oh.
That was a lot of visual effects.
Oh.
And what they needed, I remember being in the art department and doing some research at ILM for Doug Chang, who was the art director, and he said, we need to know what the University of Alabama looked like in 1960 whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, how do I find that? The local Marin County Library doesn't exactly have any of that. But my stepfather, I lived in Atlanta for a while. My stepfather knew people that went to the University of Alabama and called them up, and one of them sent me their yearbook.
Oh, wow.
So I was able to hold on to a 1960s era University of Alabama yearbook with photos in it, and that's how Doug was able to get the reference to be able to design that sequence to make it work. So there was a lot of stuff that came from unusual places.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Those are
And,
the best.
and that was all invisible visual effects that nobody knew was fake, but it was.
Yeah.
You also worked on another of my favorite movies, the live action Peter Pan from 2003.
My
I've
trip to Australia.
What? Oh, really? Oh, wow. I've seen that movie a million times. I love it.
The PJ Hogan one, right? Yeah. That was, yeah, we did all the pre-visualization for that, which was at a Warner Brothers studio outside of, like, halfway between Surfers Paradise and Brisbane, Australia. And that was really fun. That was that was a tricky shoot just because it would time and money, like all filmmaking is. And when you're doing a live action version of an animated film that's so well loved, I think Disney's kind of established a genre of it now, but back then it was pretty new and there was a lot of interesting decisions to be made.
Yeah.
It was pretty magical. What did you do on Journey of the Center of the Earth?
Well, what you're referring to, I think, is Journey to the Center of the Earth 3D, the remake,
Mm-hmm.
not the original one, and not
Right.
that
Yeah.
Yes.
and not that fantastic television show that came out when we were kids called At the Earth's Core. It's all flying birds where you can see the rigging
Oh,
and it's
yeah.
like men in costumes being rhinos, and it's so bad it's good. Anyway, Journey to the Center of the Earth 3D. So that was the first digital stereoscopic 3D film. A lot of times when people say 3D, they're referring to, it's a little bit of an ambiguous term, but what we mean in this case is that it is a stereo 3D film, meaning that your left and right eye are seeing slightly different images, and when you're in the theater, it gives you it gives you depth.
Yes.
This was the first digital version. Obviously, when we were kids, they would do anaglyph versions with red and blue glasses, but this was the first digital version. We were using, yes, what I did on it. Eric Brevig was hired to be the director. He was a visual effects supervisor at ILM, who I knew from there, and he had done a lot of second unit for Michael Bay, and is one of the most technically proficient filmmakers I've ever met. So because it was such a technical challenge and he could do all of the filmmaking stuff, he was hired as the director. So he hired me and my company to do the pre-visualization for it, and we did all of that. There was like 11 scenes. We did some of the pre-visualization in 3D so that you could put on just simple red and blue glasses and be able to see some of the depth involved. But it was, Eric would want me to say, it's the single highest grossing 3D all time until a movie called Avatar came out.
Oh, okay.
Alrighty.
And we were using Jim Cameron's Avatar cameras
Mm-hmm.
because we were before Avatar. He was designing the cameras, and we ended up using them and almost like beta testing them in a way for Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Wow.
So Eric hired me as a second unit director on that film. There's a number of ways to shoot stereoscopic. But basically what you need to do is get two cameras really close to each other, almost like human eye distance away from each other, the lenses. And when you're using regular cameras, that's really hard to do because the lenses butt up against next to each other.
Yeah.
The new way of doing it that Cameron used, and I think Vince Pace was his technical guru in this, and that Eric used for main unit was with a beam splitter. So you've got a camera pointing at the actor and then a camera pointing down with a mirror at a 45-degree angle, so you can shoot them and get those, what's called the interocular, the distance between the eyes, much more realistic to human eyes. The reason I'm telling you this is because the majority of the film was shot with those beam splitter cameras, and it was great. And second unit, I was the afterthought, so we got the old fusion cameras where the lenses are trying to get really close to each other.
Yeah.
Which works for some stuff when it's far away, but if you're shooting stuff that second unit shoots, like inserts of people's fingers on keyboards, it doesn't work. It would actually literally break your eyes. So there were plenty of times when we would be watching dailies and we'd be like, okay, David's shots are coming up. Make sure you close one eye so that
Oh, no.
you hold your hand over one eye so that you don't actually make your brain sparkle in the middle of watching David's shots.
Did you meet Brendan Fraser?
Very nice guy.
He was nice.
And The Mummy had just came out, and my dad was a huge fan of the movie The Mummy. So I went, Brendan, I'm like, I have to take a picture of me with you for my dad, because my dad loves The Mummy. And he's just an incredibly nice guy. I'm very glad that his career sort of had that comeback, because
for some of us, he never left.
Yeah, and it's rare to find super nice, humble, A-list actors.
Right.
And he really was one of them. Very nice, very accommodating. So Journey to the Center of the Earth, I was, my company did all the pre-visualization, and I was second unit director on it.
Wow.
That's so cool. And then a few years later, you got to work with us.
And then a few years later, I got to work with you because
years later. Yeah.
I was when I was sort of finishing some of my work on Star Wars, I was walking on the beach with a friend of mine in San Francisco, with a friend of mine named Jillian, who we were sort of, we knew when we were working at ILM and on Star Wars that we were working on something that was going to become the new way films were made.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about what George Lucas has done, he's kind of reinvented the entire process of filmmaking. Pre-visualization, for example, was something that I did on Star Wars, and now it's an industry standard in pre-production.
Yeah.
He was the one that pushed Sony to do the digital camera, which he used for a few shots in Phantom Menace and all of Attack of the Clones. And now digital cameras are the standard. Yeah. He was the one who created something called the Edit Droid, which was editing on Laserdisc. This was back in the 80s. And that led to the Avid, which is nonlinear editing. Yeah. We knew, Jillian and I were talking about how we were going to get to a point where you would not be able to tell the difference between a visual effect and a real actor anymore. And I remember saying something to the effect of, yes, it will become prevalent, but just because you can do a digital version of Tom Cruise doesn't mean you should.
Mm-hmm.
What's really interesting is, not that I was disagreeing with Jillian, she was totally in agreement with this, but what's really interesting is that you will be able to do something that you could never have done before with this digital technology. For example, and I said, I don't know, an elephant with zebra stripes.
Mm-hmm.
And that became an idea that I had for a kids show that had all of these animals that were mix and match skin with different animals, that magically animals were created with the skin of other animals. It was about celebrating our differences. And that became an idea that I had for a show called Safari, which was originally written and pitched around, and I got a few offers on it as a feature, but I ended up instead turning it into a TV show. And that moved it from a photorealistic style, think the recent Lion King photorealistic versions, to what was clearly a kid's animated style. But when it became a TV show, I wasn't going to be able to write it all, and I had actually never gotten a feature sold before either. So there was always going to be professional writers involved. And so I started looking around for great writers of animated content, and I was instantly recommended to the two of you. And so we got to work on Safari together. And many of my favorite episodes are ones that you guys wrote.
That was pretty fun time.
Yeah, that was an awesome experience.
Mm-hmm.
Want to
But
watch
the
those
show
again.
is beautiful.
It looks great. Yeah.
You know what? I actually got a residual check from the Directors Guild
Wow.
yesterday about
Wow.
and it was the biggest one I had gotten. So it's out there in the world playing. It's DreamWorks never released it in the US for reasons that are at a higher political or board level room meeting than I can answer. But they released it in something like 80 countries, and so it's still out there, and it's gonna. I think it may come back and still live a little bit of a life, but we did 52 11-minute episodes. It was the first TV show ever done exclusively in the Unreal game engine.
That's something to be proud of.
But when I say exclusively, I mean that we did all the rendering in the game engine. It was still too early days to do any of the animation or modeling or anything in Unreal.
Yeah.
But it was the right show at the right time to be able to use a new technology for that piece of it. Yeah. And I'm glad that we didn't try and do everything in it. A great animation company in Montreal did it with me called Digital Dimension. And they came to me and they said, we think we can do this show in Unreal. And I said, that would be great. It's long been the goal of pre-visualization artists, at least, if not final visual effects artists, to do work in a real-time game engine. And it's always been out of reach. They said, we think we can do it now. It's just the right mix of not having humans, not having fur, but it's the right characters and it's the right budget and timeline and everything. And I said, okay, well, there's these 10 things that it needs to be able to do in order for me to be okay with it. It needs to have global illumination and bump mapping and all of these technical things in order to look right.
Yep.
And they did a test and they got really close to nailing all 10. So I said, okay, let's go for it. So we were able to render the show in Unreal, which means instead of a server room of 100 rack servers rendering all night long and using all of that energy and air conditioning and expense, we had it could render theoretically on one computer in half an hour. An 11-minute episode would render in 20 to 30 minutes. Wow. We actually did a version that would render in total real time. We had to downgrade the quality a little bit. But our big joke was that when an animator got up from his workstation to go to the bathroom, his or her workstation, depending on what they were doing, we could render an episode on their computer while they were gone.
Wow.
That's I guess the next step is actually rendering a show before it's finished.
AI is working on that one. We'll render the show and then you decide if you want to watch it at all. But that was really fun. Epic was really supportive in that it was before they had really started to approach the entertainment industry as a market, because they were really just in gaming at that point. So I think it really helped them with the sort of a proof of concept. Like at the SIGGRAPH animation conference, SIGGRAPH computer graphics conference, I think in 2018, it was their first user group meeting, and they rented out a big theater in downtown Los Angeles, and they had all the Unreal users come, and they were showing all their new technology and stuff they were proud of over the last year or two, and they had two big presentations at the end of stuff they were proud of, and the last one that they were theoretically the most proud of was Safari. So we went on and we presented that we had done this entire show in Safari, and there was this little something that they didn't think was going to be quite as big as Safari, right? So they put it before Safari. This little game they were working on called Fortnite.
Oh my gosh.
So whoops, they should have reversed the order. But Safari was it was great. I was able to not totally realize my vision on that. It would be great to make a feature one day. We'll see if that ever happens. But Lord knows that as soon as it pops up again, I'm calling you guys and saying, okay, I need you to write new stuff and rewrite everything I wrote.
Well, maybe we should write a new feature.
There's a podcast you guys can listen to about how to write for animation.
Okay, we will figure that out eventually. I liked that we wrote a parade.
Yeah. Let's talk about how we wrote a parade.
I know. It seems so crazy. Yes.
It does.
Supposed to be, so parades are supposed to be live and just contemporaneous. Is that the right use of the word contemporaneous? Parades are not supposed to be written in advance, although I think a lot of them are. But what happened was, just as Macy's has its Thanksgiving Day parade every year, there's the largest store in department store in Mexico called Liverpool that has a Christmas parade every year, and they hold it in Mexico City's equivalent of Fifth Avenue. And all the major toy brands bring out their balloons and bring out their characters, and COVID hit. And because of COVID, nobody was able to go to public gatherings in, I guess this would be 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine pitched the idea to Liverpool of, you guys usually broadcast this parade on TV. Let's just make a version that goes straight to TV, and we'll animate the characters and we'll put in the crowds, and it'll all just be a digital version. So that's when I called up you guys and said, we need to write a parade, and we've got to put in 18 toy brands. I remember it being.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah.
From Lego to Barbie to Paw Patrol, all the major toy brands that you can think of. But the good news is we've got like 3 weeks to do it.
That was surreal.
It was crazy.
And the animation company that did that managed to do it in like 4 months, 450 shots, I think it was.
Wow.
And what was so great about it was, I remember the stats they told me that usually they have 500,000 people go to the live parade when they have it live.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they record it and they broadcast it on television, and they have like 2 million people watching on TV.
Yeah.
Well, our version was obviously not live. We built the digital version of the street, and then had all the animated characters from all of the toy brands, but they aired it, and I think 40 million people watched it.
Wow.
Wow.
And they sold out of those toys either 2 or 3 times in the store.
Wow.
Wow.
So it was so successful, they decided to do it the next year. Same thing. And then they decided to do it the next year. And then they said, we'll go back to the live parade. But it was still something that was really interesting to be able to write I mean, it helped that we had elves for hosts.
Yeah.
Opposed to, having to write real humans, having to shoot real humans. I think it was still like the point of COVID where people weren't even, like, all productions had stopped. They hadn't even gone back to shooting with masks yet or something.
Yeah. I mean, when we started on it, it was in the middle of just hyper isolation.
Yeah.
So there was nothing.
Yeah.
I think maybe by that Christmas, some productions were starting to shoot again, but
Ours was all animated, so everybody was working remotely.
yeah.
It was interesting. Some of the brands that I did not think would be the most exciting to work with were actually really great. Bakugan was really great to work with. I thought they were a lot of fun. I liked I liked the Lego stuff.
That was really creative what you did with it too.
Yeah, we filled the street with Lego water.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
That
Oh.
was
that was cuckoo.
yeah.
So a boat was driving around the street. That was really fun. Oh, and the Hot Wheels part was super fun. Loved the Hot Wheels part because I got to bring out sort of some of my like pod race shots, and
Oh yeah,
yeah.
the orange track. And we have created more shows together that have not gotten out into the universe yet, and we will create more, and we will make sure we get to work together more.
Yes.
I certainly hope so. I enjoy working with you guys more than anybody else.
Yeah, we like working with you too.
Yeah.
So we have to make it happen.
So in the future, there will be more. We've written a parade. Can we write?
How do we top that?
Yeah.
What would be stranger than? I mean, I've worked on some location-based entertainment stuff that's pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because you get to do stuff with it that's like simulator rides, and that can actually be fun. But I think that sometimes there's not enough story in those.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just the experience. It's just the visual experience. So that would be fun to work on with you guys. I'd love to work on something hybrid, live action and animation with you too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to work on a museum exhibit or a like a experiential thing.
Like a Meow Wolf.
Yes,
thing.
let's do that.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting because we go through these cycles in the entertainment industry where they think that digital technology will take over and you'll not have real actors anymore. Then we think that 3D stereoscopic, all films will be 3D.
Yeah.
But that becomes a niche. Then you think that all films will be, now we're in the AI will take over.
Yeah.
I think that will be a little bit more than a niche, but I think that before that one was, you were just talking about experiential. We thought that virtual reality, all films will be virtual reality.
Yeah.
No, it becomes so people still want a good story, well told.
Yes.
Beginning, middle, and end, Aristotelian structure.
Absolutely. Great characters, great story. Don't worry about AI
Yeah.
because you're right. It's always going to be about story and character.
The thing to connect with.
We are still, for better or for worse, we are still the arbiters of taste. And until AI does that, because I look at AI right now and I go, okay, you ask it to do something and I say that's beautiful and not what I need.
Yeah.
Great inspiration, it's great reference, but it's not even the fantastic stuff that has come out that people have made like little test commercials or real commercials of. It works for a commercial, but it's not a good story well told yet. So will I believe that AI will change things? Yes, it has and will continue to do so. Will I believe that it will replace all of us? No.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'm naive, but I don't think it will replace quality writing.
Yeah.
No.
I'm with you.
It has to have a soul.
Yeah. And on that note, I think we can wrap it up. It seems like a positive note that we don't have to worry about bowing to.
Oh, no, worry about it taking the robot overlords killing us. It's just that we'll be working for them when we
make our cartoons.
They're
going to say entertain me.
Okay.
Well, I have enjoyed talking about your career. This is fun. And I feel like we could do this again. I want to hear more of these stories.
Yeah.
Did I hit what you wanted to hit? I mean, I had a little venture in Silicon Valley for a while, which was sort of interesting.
Oh, we'll save that for next
Yeah,
time.
we'll save that for next time.
That one was really interesting. Anyway, thank you guys so much for inviting me onto the podcast. I love listening to you guys talk, and when I'm driving in my car and I listen to the podcast, it feels like I'm on the phone with you.
Ah,
Which
because you
is
never get to speak. Well, thank you for being here. This means
Yes,
a lot.
thank you.
No, it was my pleasure. I hope that some of it proved useful, and if there's any young animators or filmmakers out there that are listening to this, I would say pursue your passion and study old films, not just new stuff.
Yes.
A whole range of things that happened before the Marvel universe. And thank you very much for inviting me.
All right. Well,
Good.
we'll talk to you soon.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you want to get in touch with us, our Instagram is Doug and Candie Langdale. That's at DOUG_AND CANDIE LANGDALE. And thank you very much. Bye-bye.